Today our discussion will be on the Jefferson administration, the events taking place during the events of Thomas Jefferson's presidency, of case Marbury versus Madison, Louisiana Purchase, Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, the exploration of Louisiana Purchase, the Elizabeth Clark expedition, the Zebulon Pike expedition, the Embargo Act of 1807. There's the Madison administration, President James Madison talking about his increasing problems with England. Non-Intercourse Act, Bacon's Bill Number 2, the War of 1812. Then we have the Treaty against Hartford Convention, the Battle of New Orleans. Any questions on any of that? Okay. So Jefferson comes in as president March 4th, 1801. It's after the election had been sent to the House of Representatives because they couldn't figure out who the president's going to be because electoral ballots, there's no distinct ballot for president or vice president. So there's a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. 36th ballot, Jefferson finally wins. But this is the first time in American history that one party has switched power, one party has handed power over to another party. So that's some countries that's a problem because those parties don't want to give up power. Sometimes it's meant a revolution, civil war, coup d'etat, riots. But on March 4th, 1801, when Jefferson comes into office, nothing happened. They met with relative peace and calm. You see, there's one thing that has kept America going, kept it from not having quite so many problems with other nations, is the idea of consensus. As our nation operates because we mostly have ideas in common about how the government should operate. If you lose an election, well, we'll get them next time. There's always another election. The idea that we all have certain civil liberties, we all have certain rights of due process. The idea there's always going to be an election around the corner. That is consensus. We may have differences in ideas in detail of how the government should be run day-to-day operations or certain priorities, certain laws, but certain ideas we have in common. See, unlike some nations, the United States was not founded as a singularly ethnic state, founded just as a homeland for one group of people. Instead, we were founded on an ideology. The ideology of an elected representative republic with liberty and justice for all. But who they meant by all, that definition has changed over time, certainly. Well, Jefferson, as he's inaugurated, calls for reconciliation between the two parties in his inaugural address. He declares in his speech, "We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. Difference of opinion is not a difference of principle." Difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. Because he disagrees with somebody doesn't mean they're a wholesale evil person. Well, Jefferson had to clean up some of the mess from the Adams administration as he left office. The Alien Act and the Sedition Acts were allowed to expire. The Alien Enemies Act, however, kept in place. Those convicted of the Sedition Act had their fines refunded. For the Naturalization Act, the citizenship requirement was reduced from 14 years back to 5 years. So all you had to do is be here for 5 years to be a citizen. Jefferson didn't believe in spending a lot of money, so he cut back extremely on the military and the bureaucracy. He reduced to 3 the number of diplomatic missions abroad, that is, the number of ambassadors we had, the number of embassies. Just to Britain, France, and Spain, that is basically the major colonial powers in the Western Hemisphere: England, Spain, France. The Secretary of State's office reduced to the Secretary, the Chief Clerk, and 6 assistant clerks, and a handful of messengers. It had only $12,000 annual budget. Today, the Secretary of State makes more than that in a month.
Yeah.
Now, the Judiciary Act 1801, the so-called midnight judges, Jeffersonians are furious over this. Basically, a last-ditch effort by the Federalists as they left office try to pack the judiciary with as many Federalist judges as possible. Judges, U.S. attorneys, U.S. marshals, justices of the peace in the District of Columbia, you name it. The Judiciary Act was repealed in 1802 by one vote, however. This is in spite of calls to repeal the entire judiciary, as some are calling just to scrap the entire judicial branch and start over. The Supreme Court, which had been increased to 11 under Adams, is reduced back to 6. That is through attrition, just simply those who resigned or retired who weren't replaced. But there's an interesting case that comes from the whole of arguments over the midnight judges, and that is the case Marbury versus Madison. Here at Marbury, remember you underline names of court cases in the writing. Well, it happens to do with one of the 42 justices of peace named for the District of Columbia. Remember, in Arkansas, justice of peace is just simply a member of the county legislature. And you don't have any judicial powers as a justice of peace. You're a member of the quorum court, but there's no actual court. It's simply a gathering, not an actual judicial process. Some states like Texas and so forth, the justice of peace is basically a small claims court judge. And that's what we're talking about here in the District of Columbia. But one of those 42, for a city of not even 5,000 people, was a man named William Marbury. He'd been appointed Justice of the Peace. The appointment was signed by John Adams 2 days before he left office, March 2nd. But in all the chaos of the administration gathering up their papers and effects and preparing to leave the executive mansion, this White House, the letter got left behind. Basically, fell behind a desk or something and was undelivered. Well, James Madison is the new Secretary of State. And not only is he head of the Foreign Affairs Office, but basically has some domestic duties to tend to as well. Part of those is making sure that appointments to federal offices are delivered. What I mean by delivered is not just mailed. It means by an old common law concept that is certain orders and certain notices from the government and court orders are not considered to be delivered unless they are handed to the person it's addressed to. Basically, it has to be placed in your hand. Yeah. They're called process servers. Basically, the process server, you're just a messenger from the court. It could be good news, it could be bad news, but it is just a message. Yeah. So you don't know what it is. And basically, it could be anything. A court summons has to be delivered. In Arkansas, eviction notices have to be hand-delivered, have to be put in your hands. Divorce papers have to be delivered by hand, and so forth. In this case here, an appointment as a Justice of the Peace, a federal judicial appointment, had to be delivered by hand, placed in his hands. Like I said, not just word of mouth wasn't enough, just simply a letter in the mail wasn't enough, had to be placed in your hand. So Madison found this letter to William Marbury, kind of confused about it, went to Thomas Jefferson and asked him what to do about it. President Jefferson advised him simply to withhold the letter, just ignore it. But Marbury hears about it, his appointment, and he wants it. So what he does is, he ends up taking the case directly to the Supreme Court. He sues Madison to basically have the courts order Madison to hand-deliver this letter to Marbury. This case, Marbury versus Madison. Well, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is John Marshall. Now, John Marshall, he's Thomas Jefferson's cousin, but they don't like each other too much. One of those kinds of families. But here's the thing. Case goes to Supreme Court, and Marshall issues his ruling in 1803, the case to Marbury versus Madison. And what happens is Marshall splits the difference. What he said was, while Marbury basically did deserve the appointment, the Supreme Court had no power to act in this case. And the law by which the case was brought directly to the Supreme Court was unconstitutional. You see, it was brought to the Supreme Court under the Judiciary Act of 1789. One small provision of that law. This is the one that established the entire federal judiciary. The first piece of legislation passed by Congress, stating the number of Supreme Court justices, establishing the federal district courts, circuit courts of appeals, and so forth. So the Judiciary Act of 1789 said an appointment like this, if there's a dispute in a case like this, the court of first jurisdiction that is, the first court it goes to would be the Supreme Court. But the Constitution says the Supreme Court can only be the court of first jurisdiction, that is the first court you go to, only in cases involving disputes between states and questions over ambassadors, not justices of the peace. So Marshall finds a way to get out of the entire thing by saying, I can't order this letter delivered. And further states that because of the Constitution, the Judiciary Act of 1789 is unconstitutional. The first piece of legislation passed by Congress was unconstitutional. Has that priority? So basically, Marbury just kind of left twisting the wind, doesn't get his appointment, life goes on. But the case is not so important over a justice of the peace appointment. This case is more important for a more important reason. This is the first time the Supreme Court has ruled a piece of legislation unconstitutional. First time ever. Marshall establishes through this the principle of judicial review. While it had been established in the Constitution, this is the first time it's actually exercised, declaring that this legislation is unconstitutional. It is, the courts have the right to review legislation for its constitutionality. Basically, they have the right to see if a law is legal. So before the Civil War, there are only going to be two cases, two federal laws that are going to be declared unconstitutional. First, the Judiciary Act of 1789 declared unconstitutional under Marbury v. Madison. Second one is going to be the Missouri Compromise, ruled unconstitutional by the Dred Scott decision in 1857. It's the only two cases before the Civil War. So since the Civil War, lots of laws have been declared unconstitutional, but only two before the Civil War. Now, as for Marshall himself, he basically made the Supreme Court what it is, gave it its reputation in American law, gave it its really practice its authority, and made it a position to be admired among legal scholars and officers of court. And so there have been Supreme Court justices before Marshall, but he's the one that really gets it going. And so he's part about John Adams. He's on the Supreme Court for 34 years. Until his death in 1835. He issued opinions on hundreds of cases, being a lot to shape early American civil liberties, property rights, and other aspects of American law. In all those hundreds of cases, he was in the minority opinion only 8 times. There's a Supreme Court, it's a board of judges. They vote up or down on these different aspects of these cases. He's in the minority only 8 times out of hundreds of cases. Basically, if you want to win your case, you have to convince John Marshall.
No relation to Thurgood Marshall?
No.
Okay.
No relationship has ever been established. But
just check.
Yeah.
Right.
Thurgood Marshall was a very important figure of self-talk in the second half of American history. But that's John Marshall. Now Jefferson running some of the day-to-day operations of the government. Well, I didn't believe in spending a lot of money. He did establish some other important precedents. For example, the U.S. Military Academy at West Point was established under Jefferson, basically as a training academy and university for America's top Army officers. But he still hesitant about a standing professional army. He believed that what would happen is, in case the United States was invaded, the state militias would rise up to defend the nation while a large professional army is established, basically through these West Point officers. Remember, still unsure of what an army really represented. Because it's still a time when armies are used in countries around the world to suppress the population.
Right.
Basically, if there's a riot, send in the army. And in a lot of countries, it'd be the army sometimes threatening to overthrow the government. They didn't like what the government was doing. They didn't want that to happen either. That's why in some countries today, a couple in Central America actually abolished their army altogether. Several others, soldiers have no right to vote. Basically, they're going to stay out of politics. The Federalist whiskey taxes and excise taxes were eliminated. Jefferson kept the National Bank intact, but let its charter expire later, turning all these federal deposits back to the state banks. But he reduced the national debt by half. In 1801, the national debt was at $80 million. Fiscal year 1810, down to $40 million. There's only going to be one president who leaves office without a national debt. Andrew Jackson in 1837.
Question.
Yeah.
Can you define what the national debt is?
Basically, it's what the federal government owes to whatever creditors, other foreign governments, private interests in the United States, U.S. citizens, whatever else.
Okay.
Most of the national debt we have is what we owe to ourselves. About $18 trillion, but a lot of us, because Congress has been borrowing from the Medicare and Social Security trust funds, basically those excesses, surpluses, government borrows keep the government fund running, but still has to pay that back. Native American reservations trust funds, basically the mineral rights from all the reservations, those are put in a trust fund. The government borrows from that. Savings bonds, treasury bills, those are parts of the national debt.
Yeah.
Sometimes the government owes it simply to banks. Yeah, deficit is what the government funding shortfall is in a given year. That is, how much government spends versus how much it has.
Right.
Debt is the accumulation of all those debts put together. Well, another interesting incident you have during the Jefferson administration is can we call it the Barbary Coast War. It's in 1804 to 1805. Basically, it has to do with American trade in the Mediterranean. The Barbary Coast they're referring to here is basically North Africa, particularly what we call today Tunisia and Libya, and portions of Morocco. Basically, a series of pirates have been operating out of these ports in North Africa, and they've been extorting countries trading in the Mediterranean for many years. Pirates missing ships, and the European powers are paying protection to prevent this. The United States had done this as well until 1801, until we decided, no, we're not going to do it anymore. Leader of the city of Tripoli, the Pasha, basically upped the payments on the protection money, basically trying to shake down the U.S. Jefferson said he is not going to pay this anymore, not a dime of it. And the Pasha of Tripoli declares war on the U.S. by chopping down the flagpole of the U.S. consulate at Tripoli. Basically, embassies and consulates, that's considered to be sovereign territory of an individual nation. And this basically is just basically an act of vandalism, but it was considered basically an attack on an American sovereign territory. In response, the U.S. Navy, a little more than 16 ships at this point, blockaded Tripoli. It's right there on the coast. And a small war of sorts dragged on until about 1805. Basically just a few small shootouts between ships here in the Mediterranean. Punctuated in 1805 by Lieutenant Stephen Decatur burning the frigate Philadelphia in Tripoli harbor after it had been captured after running aground. Basically, it ran into a sandbar, it was wrecked, and Decatur burns it. The Pasha of Tripoli captured the crew and demands $300,000 for its capture, but in 1804, but in 1805 settled for $60,000. And after that, the United States never paid another dime to the Barbary Coast pirates and never had a problem with them ever again. Basically, they had to pay some money to them, but they never bothered us again afterwards. So that's the Barbary Coast. Now you get to the Louisiana Purchase. And it all has to do with France. 1791. Slaves rose up in the French possession of Saint Dominique. Massive slave rebellion. Present-day nation of Haiti. Killed the slave owners and drove the French all out of the area. This is the most successful slave revolt in history. As the slaves rose up, drove out the owners, completely freed themselves, and were never subdued again. So all those descendants, all the slaves, still free to this day. Well, tragically, it's the most poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. So, in 1799, that's during the French Revolution, a few years later, Napoleon comes to power in France. And Napoleon has dreamed not only a conquest in Europe, but restoring the French Empire in North America. It's a goal shared by many Frenchmen, but part of that would be recapturing Saint Dominique. So in 1802, Napoleon sent the force down to Saint Dominique, but they run into a lot of problems. They're fighting a tropical environment, so there's a lot of bugs and cases of malaria. which cripples the French force, and plus the fact hit-and-run guerrilla fighting by the Haitian rebels effectively dislodged the French force, so Napoleon abandoned Saint-Dominique once and for all. Now, guerrilla, it's French for, comes the French word guerre, which means war, hit-and-run tactics. Napoleon fails to retake Haiti in 1802. But 1803, Spain is basically under French control at this point. In fact, in a few years, Napoleon's going to place his brother on the throne of Spain, basically making his brother King of Spain. Before that happens, though, Napoleon, in a secret treaty, forces Spain to transfer ownership of western Louisiana back to France. Remember, Treaty of Paris, 1763, into the French and Indian War. France basically abandons the mainland of North America. The portion of Louisiana east of the Mississippi River goes to England. The portion west goes to Spain. 1803, Napoleon forces Spain to hand western Louisiana back to France. It's a secret treaty, but word was getting out. That's a considerable problem because as more settlers, more trappers and traders were heading west of the Appalachians, the Mississippi River is an increasingly important avenue of commerce for the United States. And the idea of Napoleon in control of France, particularly the port at New Orleans, which was vital for American interests as it had been under Spanish control, now it's under French control, is greatly worrying President Jefferson. France is a very powerful country. They overrun nearly every country in Europe at this point. Continental Europe basically would be under French control for the better part of a decade. So Jefferson administration is worried that Napoleon may have designs of North America too. Napoleon's kind of thinking of that idea, but he hadn't really developed much of a plan yet. So at this point, the U.S. Ambassador to France, Robert R. Livingston, is ordered to approach France about the possibility of buying the port of New Orleans. Basically just the city. Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, surprises the Americans by offering not only the port of New Orleans, but the whole thing, all Louisiana, to the United States. Actually, Livingston's a little bit stunned by this, but says, okay. See, Napoleon, he's still fighting a lot of wars back and forth here across Europe, and needs some quick cash so he can keep his army funded. Since selling Louisiana, even though he may decide to retake it later, he hasn't that money in the meantime. So the treaty is quickly signed, April 30th, 1803. The entire Louisiana territory sold to the United States for $15 million. Works out to about 3 cents per acre. That's a pretty good deal.
That's a darn good deal.
It is. Well, the thing is, the treaty kind of vaguely defined the borders of Louisiana Purchase. See, pictured here, page 239 in your book. Gave Texas a tenuous claim to Texas and West Florida, but basically, Louisiana Purchase was the entire Mississippi River Basin, the western end of it, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, all the way out west to Minnesota and Wyoming. Basically the Great Plains of the United States. But Jefferson is impressed by the treaty, but it's kind of presented by a problem at first. So Jefferson was what they call a strict constructionist of the Constitution. Wouldn't do anything the Constitution would explicitly give power to the federal government to do. And see, if you read the Constitution, there's nothing there specifically says federal government can buy land. Jefferson's actually considering pushing through a constitutional amendment to allow the government to do that, but the vice expense of this power lay in the treaty-making provisions of the Constitution. It's simply a treaty here. So the treaty is approved by the Senate. Only the Senate votes on this. On December 20th, 1803, by a vote of 26-6. America took formal possession from French officials in New Orleans. They'd taken over from Spanish officials only 3 weeks earlier. In fact, when American troops arrived at the Arkansas Post, which was the only European settlement in Arkansas at the time, where the White and the Mississippi River meet, they took over directly from Spanish officers who had no idea that Louisiana had been sold to France at all, and then France had turned around and sold it to the United States. So that was kind of an awkward moment for the United States, but settled that problem. But it's hard to underestimate the impact of the Louisiana Purchase. This doubles the size of the United States overnight. The Louisiana Purchase, this is the largest peaceful transfer of land in history.
Right,
Peaceful.
right.
That's the operative word here. Yeah, there are countries that have taken big chunks of that other countries before. Countries that have doubled the size of their country in a very short time, but that's by forcefully taking it by their armies.
Killing everyone up here.
Exactly. United States, all we needed was a check and a receipt. And we doubled the size of our country overnight. So, politically, it gave Jefferson almost solid support in the South and the West. I can say a lot of fallout from it here. 1810, American settlers in the Baton Rouge area, basically the Upper Toe area of Louisiana. Well, Spain still controlled that whole area from Baton Rouge, the area north of Lake Pontchartrain called the North Shore area, all the way out to across the Florida Panhandle of Florida itself. Well, Baton Rouge being so close to New Orleans, these American settlers living there, after getting both the population side, they want to be part of America too. They don't want to be part of Spain anymore. So they staged an uprising and declared themselves to be the Republic of West Florida. Basically, that whole toe area was basically western Florida. It wasn't really ever recognized as a country, but it was annexed by the U.S. in 1812. In 1812, Louisiana itself was admitted as the 18th state. Republic of West Florida incorporated the entire state of Louisiana. In fact, you ever drive down I-12 from Baton Rouge to the Mississippi state line, Louisiana calls it the Republic of West Florida Freeway. Sometimes, and not often, it's those areas, those parishes are called the Florida parishes, but not very often anymore. It's just more and more, it's just kind of people start moving north of Lake Pontchartrain from the New Orleans area, so they just call it the North Shore. That's how it gets added in. Now, Jefferson had always been a scientist at heart. And he wants to know just what exactly is in the Louisiana Purchase area. What exactly do we get for all this territory? So he has Congress put together some funding for several scientific expeditions, exploration. And one of these was, or most famously, the Lewis and Clark expedition. The fauna and wildlife and geography is still largely unknown to the United States, and this expedition led by Army Lieutenant William Clark, and Jefferson's personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis. They're in command of an expedition called the Corps of Discovery. It's them and 50 men. So it's not just two of them, it's 50 guys there. Essentially, they're going to start up in the St. Louis area and travel up the Missouri River, basically to find the source waters for it. Basically, just along the way, exploring the area, basically exploring the Missouri River Valley. You can all see this on map, page 239 here. Along the way, they discovered such creatures never before seen as the prairie dog, never before seen by Western scientists. Encountered new types of vegetation. And along the way, they met a woman named Sacagawea. She is the wife of a French trapper. She's Native American, and she basically helped translate for the expedition as they traveled further across the plains. We can speak multiple languages. He's a very good diplomat. Lewis and Clark, they couldn't speak any of these Native American languages. Sacagawea basically helps pave the way for them to go further west, so tribes don't misunderstand the intentions of these men. So they travel all the way out into the Rocky Mountains. Once they reach the headwaters of the Missouri River, they actually go a little bit further out, going all the way out to the Pacific coast, down the Columbia River to the Pacific Ocean, the border of Washington to Oregon. So basically, by going all that way far out west, it gives America kind of a very thin claim on the Pacific Ocean as a boundary. Remember, the Louisiana Purchase Treaty never explicitly defined the borders of the Louisiana Purchase. When Livingston asked Talleyrand about that, Talleyrand simply said, "Go make the best of it." So the U.S., through the Louisiana Purchase, is basically saying, going all out to the Louisiana Purchase, going out to the Pacific Ocean. But France never officially had a claim out there. But the United States, though, is through its exploration Louisiana Purchase, is pushing out beyond what would be what had been the French territory, all the Pacific. So there aren't any really, nobody really has much of a claim out there at all, except for different tribes. Russia briefly had a claim out there. Spain briefly had a claim out there. Britain briefly had a claim out there, but now the United States is added into the mix. On their way back, they split up. They explored the Yellowstone country in 1806, returned as national heroes. Another expedition that's roughly the same time period was the Hunter-Dunbar expedition. 1804 to 1805. Essentially, starting from Mississippi, they travel up the Washita River area through this area. Basically going up as far north as Hot Springs, is basically exploring this area, coming back, and leaving their report to Congress as well. Not nearly as important or as long a journey as the Lewis and Clark expedition, but it's important for the South Arkansas and North Louisiana area. And so it's because of this expedition you have a lot of settlement coming in this area afterward. In 1907, you have the Zebulon Pike expedition. Pike, like William Clark, was an Army lieutenant. But basically, it's mostly just Pike by himself on this. Jefferson sent Pike on an expedition to find the source of the Mississippi River, but Pike gets confused, gets lost along a tributary, and is heading west instead of north. So the source of the Mississippi River is actually in central Minnesota. But instead, he treks west across the Great Plains, basically across Kansas and into Colorado. He discovered Pike's Peak, tallest mountain in Colorado, tried to climb it, wasn't able to do so. But by crossing into the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, he had now entered Spanish territory. The Spanish captured him and just want to know is what exactly a U.S. Army lieutenant was doing in Spanish territory. But he's eventually returned after a few diplomatic inquiries. Pike's account, though less full than Lewis and Clark, gave Americans an overall look at the Rockies and the Great Plains. And for years afterward, basically because of Pike's expedition, on maps of the United States of the Louisiana, the Great Plains area, from roughly Oklahoma to the Dakotas, the area can be called the Great American Desert.
Oh.
Basically, ever been out to Oklahoma, Kansas, notice it's a lot drier than it is out here in Arkansas and further east back towards the Appalachian and the Atlantic. Outside here, heavily forested, very wet. Even our dry years, it's a lot wetter than it is in Oklahoma or Kansas. It's basically that way all the way back east to the Atlantic Ocean. It's very heavy vegetation, a lot of precipitation. Actually, and that's where Pike had come from. That's the kind of agriculture and environment he's used to, is a lot of precipitation, a lot of vegetation, a lot of forests. And that's basically back east, that's how people thought anything that didn't have that wouldn't be suitable for agriculture or human habitation. So Pike goes out in that mindset, so he goes out into Kansas and into eastern Colorado. There are very few natural trees. Basically, it's just flat grasslands to get to the Rocky Mountains. And thought such a dry area, no natural trees, that the area was unfit for human habitation, that it was basically a desert. But, interesting little side note to this. Like I said, we can see the shift in Arkansas as we travel down I-40, starting west Memphis. It's very heavily forested, swampland on west Memphis. We start to notice it getting drier and drier as you go further west. Next time we got to Fort Smith, it's not so much out there, a lot drier area. But the irony is, though, because of that, as America pushed further west, because of this idea of the Great American Desert, people skipped over, basically, the Great Plains in the 1840s and 1850s and went straight out to Oregon, Washington, and California. Then, sometime in the 1850s, people realized about Kansas, hey, you grow a bunch of wheat out here. That it wasn't such a worthless scrubland as Pike had originally thought. Back today, the Great Plains, that whole area from North Texas up to southern Canada, is known as the breadbasket of the world. More grains are produced in that area than any other place in the world. Actually, America feeds the world just from that little spot. This little state's going from Texas to North Dakota. Eventually, all or parts of 13 states are going to originate from the Louisiana Purchase, including, of course, Arkansas. Well, now we get to April 1804, and we return to the story of Aaron Burr. Vice President of the United States. Like I said, Aaron Burr, what can you not say about the man? He is, basically, he's the worst stereotype of politician. It goes even beyond that. He's a crook, he is a liar, he's a philanderer. He is, he'll do whatever it takes for political power. Lie, cheat, steal, kill.
He's the man then. Good job.
Have you ever seen that show, House of Cards? The character they have on that, Frank Underwood? Nothing compared to Aaron Burr. Remember election of 1800.
So you would describe Aaron Burr as greedy, as a hungry piranha.
Greedy, piranha, scoundrel, you name it.
Power hungry man.
Pretty much. Psychotic, maybe. I don't know.
I mean, he kills people just to get power. I
Yeah.
think that's
Oh, yeah.
kind of psychotic.
And stories get even better from here. Remember, election of 1800, Jeffersonian Republicans nominate Thomas Jefferson for president and Aaron Burr for vice president. But because they had set up the elections at that point, you don't have distinct ballots for president or vice president. Basically, each elector gets 2 votes. Suddenly, the winner becomes president. The second most number of votes becomes vice president. But because the parties have established tickets, they have all these Jeffersonian electors. They all voted for Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. There's no distinguishing between the two. That's why it had to go to the House of Representatives. Now, you'd think ordinarily a decent, honorable man would say, no, I was nominated for vice president. Our choice of our party is Thomas Jefferson. He should be the president. I'll step aside and let him be president. That's not Aaron Burr. Oh, no, he went for the whole thing. So you can understand that Thomas Jefferson isn't too happy with Aaron Burr at this point. So Burr figures out he's probably not going to be on the ticket again in 1804. That's it. You know, I figured that one out. But, so he ran for governor of New York. So he's from New York. It was a very prestigious position. But Alexander Hamilton, who ironically had actually pushed the Federalists in Congress to push Burr for president in 1800, sent out a pamphlet telling the voters of New York that Burr was dangerous and should not be trusted with the office of governor. He's to keep him as far away from the governor's mansion in Albany as possible.
True that.
Well, Burr lost the election. And Burr blamed Hamilton for the defeat and challenged him to a duel. Well, dueling is illegal in the state of New York.
What is it?
So, like all good New Yorkers, they take it to Jersey. It's legal there.
That might explain why.
Yeah. Well, Hamilton's kind of romantic. He goes to duel to prove his honor. According to the Hamilton family legend, he wasn't there to fire, but the Burr family, they dispute that very strongly. Ironically, they choose the same spot where Alexander Hamilton's son had died in a duel a year earlier.
Same for the dad.
I say dueling is very common at this point, especially in the South, until about the Civil War. Because the idea at this time when honor meant everything, your reputation meant everything. I've heard the phrase "death before dishonor." They really lived it. They'd rather die than have something bad be thought about them. But then fame meant a lot of people know you, and a lot of people think very highly of you. It's not just a lot of people know your name. You see these idiots on TV making fools out of themselves. No, they'd be publicly humiliated back then. They would be notorious, shunned from society. Yeah, they would. Yeah. This is not a society that made stupid people famous. So,
Dude.
yeah. Burr family, some studies suggested that Hamilton's pistol had a hair trigger on it, basically trying to give him that extra split second to get the shot off. But basically, duels, it was just about everything. A duel, you could fist fights sometimes, sword fights, but more and more at this point it's pistols. Single shot 54 caliber pistols. So that'll hurt your feelings. And the thing is, you shoot that, that one chance to get your pistol shot off, and if you shoot and miss, and that guy hasn't fired yet, you got to stand there while he is.
Oh, heck no.
But a lot of times what would happen is simply they meet on the field of honor, honor's been satisfied, they shake hands, they fire their pistols in the air, go their separate ways. Actually, they met, they prove their point, they go on. Now here's what happens is the former Secretary of the Treasury, the guy with the $10 bill, and the Vice President of the United States are here with guns ready to shoot each other. Now this is the point when Vice President shooting people wasn't considered didn't happen very often. Well, Hamilton fired his shot, Burr gets his shot, pow! Burr shoots and mortally wounds Alexander Hamilton. After laying on the ground, mortally wounded, they bring him back in a boat back across to New York where Hamilton dies. And now Aaron Burr, the Vice President of the United States, is wanted for murder in both New York and New Jersey. Well, Burr's political career is basically over at this point. He fled to Spanish territory, later returned to preside over the Senate. Remember, he's still Vice President of the United States. So he's presiding over the Senate, senators screaming at him and making fun of him. So he leaves Washington again. Later meets up with a man named General James Wilkinson, who was a double agent. Basically, he was a spy for both the United States and Spain. Yeah, made money off both. And apparently, this is where the story gets really weird. Sought some kind of scheme to break Louisiana away from the Union, set up an independent republic with basically himself in charge. But the thing is, he keeps telling people a different story, trying to raise money for this scheme. Some said he wanted to lead an invasion of Spanish territory. Some said that Spanish Florida, Mexico, South America, Canada even. But guy's getting weird even for James Wilkinson. So Wilkinson goes to Washington and tells Jefferson that this guy's planning some kind of plot to declare war and take over Louisiana. So Jefferson sends out people out to look for Burr. Burr is found in Mississippi in 1806, trying to organize volunteers. He's brought back to Washington for trial. Charged of treason. Former Vice President accused of treason. Well, the trial is held in Richmond, Virginia. Jefferson hated Burr and wanted him convicted to meet Price. John Marshall is presiding over the trial. He hated Jefferson too. In fact, what he did was actually probably get him kicked off the court in a lot of cases today. He actually attended a dinner in support of Aaron Burr. And Marshall, as the trial judge, found Burr not guilty of treason for a very specific reason. It says in the Constitution, to be convicted of treason, you have to have 2 witnesses to each overt act. But you couldn't find 2 witnesses to tell the exact same story because Burr kept telling people different things. Well, after that, Burr skipped the country, went to England for a while, later returned to New York to practice law. Yes, he was a lawyer. At the age of 77, he married his second wife, former prostitute said to be the richest woman in America. Made her run money the really old-fashioned way. In his will, he named 2 illegitimate daughters, both under 10 years old, as partial heirs. Aaron Burr died at the age of 80 on the day he was divorced from his second wife on the grounds of adultery. He is committing adultery against her. And that is Vice President Aaron Burr.
Wow. That is some kind of life story. Right?
Oh, yeah. And I get to the election of 1804, not nearly as colorful. Thomas Jefferson had a new running mate, obviously.
Yeah.
George Clinton of New York, in relation to Bill. And the Federalists went with Charles C. Pinckney, their nominee, Vice Presidential nominee from 1800. And their Vice Presidential nominee, Rufus King. Yeah, Rufus, actually a common name back then. Well, Jefferson walloped Pinckney because of the popularity of Louisiana Purchase, unpopularity of the Federalists. They won by a margin of 162 electoral votes to 14. Huge margin. America's prospering thanks to the war in Europe. America trading with both sides. Settlers streaming west. Ohio was admitted as the 17th state in 1803. In 1807, Jefferson signed a law banning the foreign slave trade as of January 1st, 1808, the earliest date possible under the Constitution. South Carolina is the only state that still actually practiced the importation of slaves. But illegals can only continue for decades. When we get back next time, we'll talk more about the Madison administration and the War of 1812. So keep reading books, chapters 9 and 10, and we'll see y'all next time.